Mommy, come on, I want to play my ball.
I extend a pleasant good evening to everyone. A pleasant good evening to everyone, and a warm welcome is extended to everyone. Our consultant this evening, Dr. Paula Cook-McKinnon. We also have our very esteemed lead person for this session, Mrs. Fortuna Anthony. We extend a warm welcome to all parents to this meeting, as well as any other community members who are joining us this evening. It is a very important session for all of us in the education sector, where we engage you, important participants, in the discussion of this reviewed Education Act, which has implications for all of us. So it is a very important session for us. And of course, I am elated, and I extend a very warm welcome to everyone, and I encourage everyone to engage actively in the discussion. You have this excellent opportunity to transform, to contribute to this very important discussion on the Education Act consultation. So we proceed very importantly next to our prayers, and I invite those who are Catholic to please sign yourselves in the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. O Heavenly Father, we thank you most graciously for the breath of life we are able to enjoy. And of course, most importantly, we thank you for this opportunity for all of us to engage in a discussion on something that is so important to the education system, the Education Act review. We thank you again, Father, for this opportunity, and we ask you to guide our discussions, help everyone to be comfortable, but of course, engage in a discussion that is respectful and valuable, so that we can make a very important contribution this evening. This we ask in the name of your Son, Jesus. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, the Holy Spirit. Amen. And of course, I have mentioned our consultant for this evening. I also mentioned our lead person for the discussions this evening, Mrs. Fortuna Anthony. And for those who do not know Mrs. Fortuna Anthony, she was a former Chief Education Officer, and also she has been actively involved in community projects, etc. One of those is working with at-risk boys in the society. And of course, she has also worked with the Universal Peace Federation. And one of the important things that they have worked on is character development in young persons. So without much ado, I hand you over to Mrs. Fortuna Anthony. And once again, welcome everyone, and I encourage everyone to engage in the discussion. Your contribution, your thoughts, your input are invaluable to us in the education sector. Thank you so much for your attendance this evening, and most importantly, for the invaluable contributions that you will make this evening. Thank you so much. Over to you, Mrs. Fortuna Anthony.
Thank you ever so much, Mrs. Lawrenson, DEO District 3, for your welcome and your words of devotion, and asking everyone here to raise their voices. They've got a voice and they can make a valuable contribution. I thank you very much for agreeing to introduce this evening's town hall meeting in District 3 for members of the public, educators, and whoever is so willing to understand a little more about the Draft Education Act. Also with us, and I'm going to ask my colleagues to turn on the video so that people can see the persons who have been working over the last 2 years on this project. We have with us, and they will say a little bit about themselves, Mrs. Paula Cook McKinnon, and she will turn on her video and she will say a little bit about herself. Paula?
Thank you, Mrs. Anthony. Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be having these discussions about the Education Act and the supporting regulations which are proposed. We have been very busy over the last 2 years working with educators and stakeholders in St. Lucia to develop recommendations for enhancement of the Education Act and the regulations. My role with this team has been to support the development, to support the technical members of our team, and to also support the drafting of the recommended act and regulations that you are able to access now online. Drafting is a specialized function, and we are very grateful to Kim St. Rose, who has actually done an exemplary job of the drafting. This evening is not so much about us, but about you. We are absolutely delighted to have this opportunity to have public sessions, these town hall sessions, so that you can express to us your desires for the act, how you hope it will work for you, and to give us feedback on regulations, which are a first for St. Lucia in terms of recent education acts. So very progressive. And also included in the regulations is a new national code of conduct to support school leaders and teachers to have a consistent approach to conduct of members of school communities throughout the country. So thank you so much, Mrs. Anthony, and I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you. And I would like Dr. Monica Williams, who is also with us, to say a few words and introduce herself.
Good evening, everyone. My name is Dr. Monica Williams, and it's a pleasure to be here as a member of the team that's working in partnership with educators in St. Lucia on the enhancement of the Education Act. It's been a great privilege to work with everyone over the past 2 years. We've had many consultations and done quite a bit of research. And my background is in education leadership and also in school law, and also special education and inclusive education. And those are the skills that I bring to the work. And it's been a real pleasure. And I look forward to the conversation this evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Williams. Dr. Williams has been what I describe as the rock to this process moving forward. Next slide, please, Paula. So this is our schedule for this evening. We want to run a tight ship. So we have had the welcome and devotion. We are going to share with you the schedule, the purpose, and the ground rules for this meeting so that we make the most effective use of the time that we have together this evening. We would get a brief description of the review, an overview and discussion of the core features of the Draft Education Act and regulations. Your priorities and hopes for the draft would be very, very critical and important to us. So we want to have sufficient time to hear your voice. And as Mrs. McKinnon has said, for the first time, St. Lucia is creating history in having an Education Act and accompanying regulations. Then we will have the concluding remarks, and we will adjourn at about 7:30. So far, we have done quite well in terms of the numbers of participants and the time. We have not run too badly into overtime or overrun, but this evening we will want to hear from you. Thank you very much. So what is the purpose or the objectives of the town hall meetings? We want to describe and review the enhancement. What are the new things that we have brought in? We want to discuss the core features of the Draft Education Act and Regulation. We want to present those core features to you this evening. We want to listen to your priorities and hopes for the Draft Education Act and Regulations, with the hope that you have had sufficient time to peruse the Act and regulations that have been placed on the government website. And if you have not yet done so, Mrs. McKinnon has placed that in the chats. We want to record your questions and comments. So I hope we do have your permission to record, since we want to be able to represent accurately what you have shared with us, so that as we move forward, any changes can reflect your voices. We want to address the topics and issues raised in the town hall meetings, in the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. So we have two words there that are very, very important. We want to validate and we want to finalize. As Mrs. McKinnon has mentioned, this process has been on for almost 2 years. And we want you now, since we have the draft, what we probably would refer to as a bill, because there is a process before it becomes an act. When we have done our 9 or 10 town hall meetings, we will take into consideration what you have raised, and then new edits would have to be done. Then it moves on to the minister, the Attorney General's office, and then to Parliament, so that it can become an act. Next slide, Paula. So, what are the ground rules for this meeting, this town hall meeting? We know we have to remain within a structure, so your questions or comments are welcome. If you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see that there is an icon that says reactions. You can raise your hand. It says raise hand. When you have asked your question, it says you could put your hand down, or you can type in the chat your comments. We will try to address the comments that have been typed, or we will, when you raise your hand, we will acknowledge and you will take time to share. The facilitators will chair the meeting, so we work as a team. So you might hear my voice, you will hear Mrs. McKinnon's voice, and you could hear Dr. Williams' voice when needed. The meeting will start and end promptly, and thank you, Mrs. Lawrenson. We started promptly. To speak during the meeting, I have explained what you do. You raise your hand, you say who you are, and then you have about 3 minutes. We are saying 3 minutes so that we provide opportunities for other persons to have a voice. We appreciate and respect all questions and comments and ask that you do the same. No question asked should be seen as invalid. So we appreciate that mutual respect. In Jamaica, we say, we give enough respect to each person. So in St. Lucia, we learn to appreciate each other's point of view. Next slide. So a brief description of the review. How did we go about getting to where we are today? We noted earlier that we started in February 2022 when the St. Lucia Department of Education contracted the Mind Bloom Consulting and St. Francis Xavier University to partner with St. Lucia educators in the review and enhancement of the Education Act. So there was a bidding process. The review was undertaken because the existing act is from 2005, and the Department of Education wishes to ensure that the Education Act that is in use in St. Lucia meets the needs of the modern education system now and in the future. Those of you who are keeping abreast with what is going on recognize that times are changing and education cannot be stagnant. So from February 2022 up to the present time, we have had extensive stakeholders consultation and research has been completed. We have met with many persons. Based on the findings of the consultations and research, intensive research on what is happening in education regionally and internationally, the Draft Education Act and regulations were prepared in March 2023. We have provided 2 drafts, and we are where we are today. Multiple stakeholders provided feedback on this draft. We had a series of Zoom meetings working with various groups, and persons were free to send in their thoughts after the meeting. So more than 700 suggestions were received, reviewed, and acted upon to create a revised Draft Education Act and regulations that we are presently discussing here tonight. This is the journey. The town hall meetings are being held across St. Lucia, from District 1 way down to District 8, and special meeting with all principals of schools to provide. The general public has been invited as well. If we have been following, the Ministry of Education has placed on government URL. I have seen it on DBS being advertised, and everyone is being invited to join via the link that was provided. A description of the review of the Education Act 2005 and the progress we have achieved to date. The access to the revised November 2023 Education Act and regulations, and an opportunity to contribute to the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. So, what are the core features of the Draft Education Act and regulations? We have attempted to hearing, after listening, after researching, to bring in, using our stakeholders' plea or our stakeholders' suggestions. We have a new student-centered vision for education for St. Lucia. Student-centered. We have expanded the definitions and updated the language. We heard from our participants or our stakeholders that they needed to have more definitions, and we have done that. They wanted the language to be written in such a way that everyone would understand, and we have done that. The only thing I can say we could not do was to put Creole version. But somewhere along, I would say this evening, if there's anybody who wants a Creole translation, they've just got to put it in the chat or raise their hand. But we have updated the language in the Act so that it is more reader-friendly. We focus on a holistic education that supports student learning and well-being. This is what education is meant to do. Holistic development of the child. So we are looking at the child's mental well-being. We are looking at the child academic well-being. We are looking at how happy a young one is prepared to come to school. Universal access to education, free tuition, and protection from discrimination is one of the key features in the Act. So we want every child to have access to school, that they do not have to pay, and they are protected from discrimination. So we will hear a little more about that. And presently, there is a lot being done, and a lot of training is taking place across a number of groups on safeguarding of children, their parents, and people generally. New content on special needs education and inclusive education has been established and placed in the Act. New National Code of Conduct, standards of behavior, and appropriate dress code. So the new National Code will go across the education system. New compulsory school age from 3 to 17, including early childhood age education for ages 3 to 5. So you will see there is a change in the compulsory school age, which was from 5 to 15. And we have even gone beyond that in some cases. The clear authority of educators to discipline students and protect safety and security. In whose hands have we placed the disciplining of students, the protection of teachers and parents and children? It is now in the hands, the authority lies with the educators. New types of education has been added, including alternative online and blended education. And in spite of everything, we know that if there was a plus to COVID, we were forced to move onward. So the new Education Act is preparing educators, parents, and the nation for if any such matter was to come through again. But also asking educators to make good use of, let us say, the blended approach, the online, so that the practice, usage is always there. We have clearly defined the rights, duties, powers, and responsibilities of everyone in the Education Act, so that we have provided clarity. An overview of the Draft Education Act. There is what we call the preliminary, and it is referred to as the long title were recommendations, the interpretation of the definition. So you will see that there are many more definitions in there. So recommendations came in from different stakeholders. They wanted a greater emphasis on the holistic student development and the well-being of students and all that. They wanted the promotion of inclusive education. So all that takes place in the long title. We also looked at curriculum, etc., and the purpose administration of the education system. Who is in charge? The duties and powers of the minister has been clearly outlined, that of the permanent secretary, the chief education officer, education officers that were not in the Education Act are now in there, and education advisory board. Stage 2 of the stages of education and the types of school, stages of public schools, types of education offered, registration and operation of schools, homeschooling has been extended and it has more clarity to it, special needs education and inclusive education. The rights and responsibilities of students and parents. Universal access, there must be universal access to education for all. We said it has to be free. The rights to an appropriate education is also spelled out there. There is also the accountability, the responsibilities, the consequences, rights and duties of students and parents. Admission, attendance and records. The compulsory school age is listed there. How are they admitted to schools? The zoning of schools. How do you transfer a student from one school to the next? What is the process? What is the attendance? How is the attendance of a student kept? The types of registers, who keeps those registers? How are they used to attend to the needs of the child? The school attendance officer and school records. Who keeps the records? What type of records are kept so that the education system is responsive and meeting the needs of the child? The national curriculum is in part 5, which deals with instruction and assessment of students. And we have an inclusive national curriculum, inclusive across the board, whether you are at an assisted school, whether you're at homeschooling, you have a national curriculum which everyone should be using. The core subjects, it mentions what are the core subjects, the key stages of assessments, balanced student assessment. It speaks of the collective worship and religious education. So in this section, the national curriculum, you will see that schools, whether you're denominational or not, you have the option of adding to the core subjects. So for example, we know that there are certain schools where instruction, religious education must be taught. They have the option of adding it to their curricula. Part 6 looks at the management of schools, boards of management for technical and vocational education and training councils, student councils, parent-teacher community association. And I want us to take a look at this one. We know that there have been student councils in operation in schools. there have been boards at various schools, but we normally would have had parent teachers association. But we have added, because there was the discussion that the management of schools should also be extended to communities. So we have parent-teacher community. So in a district, you might have persons who are ready and willing to serve on that parent-teacher community to strengthen the work of the school. You have the National Code of Conduct in Part 7, School Rules and Discipline. This is critical because this National Code of Conduct, how we respond to discipline, to student misbehavior, suspensions, searches and seizures, the right to appeal a disciplinary response is all in this section of the Act. And it is written and clarified so that parents should understand. Principals will be guided accordingly. District education officers would be able to reference whenever they come across an issue that impacts whether it is on a student, a parent, etc. So this National Code of Conduct is going to strengthen what happens at the school level, and it touches on a number of areas. Part 8 looks at the rights and duties of educators. What is the rights of the educators? What is the duty of the principal, the vice principal, teachers, school guidance counselors, school attendant officers? What are their rights and duties? Part 9 looks at the St. Lucia Scholarship, and it has been suggested the value of the scholarship. What are the qualifications? What examinations are there for the scholarships? How do you forfeit the scholarship? Bonding for the scholarship recipients. How do you award or grant bursaries? You can always look at the Education Act in full detail and see what it says. Appeals. If you disagree, if you do not like something, if you feel that you have not had justice served, there will be an education appeal tribunal, and there will be regulations and procedures as to how one can appeal. And there is the miscellaneous section that looks at annual reports, contagious diseases, closures of school, loitering on school premises. We did not touch on loitering outside of school premises. Insurance, vendors on the school premises, prohibition of sale of alcohol, drugs, prosecution, regulations, repeals, savings. So this section, I think you would find certain forms that will guide how you move forward with, let us say, if there is an outbreak of contagious diseases, what is the procedure that is used? Questions, comments? Are we getting a feel? Are we getting a grasp of what this enhanced act would look like? Feel free. We want to hear your comments. We need to hear your voice. We have Okay, we have no questions in the chat as yet. You can place your questions in the chat. You can raise your hand.
We have one. Oops, we have one raised hand from Yolanda. Would you like to go ahead, please?
Good night, everyone.
Good night.
I see everything there well put in place, but I'm not seeing anything on safety and security for the students and parents at school. Can you explain?
Monica, would you like to respond to this? Is Monica still with us?
Yes.
Yes, thank you, Fortuna. I'd be happy to respond. That's an excellent question about safety and security. We heard from many persons over the past almost 2 years that they have concerns about safety and security at school, and they want the Education Act and the regulations to address those issues. So what we've done is added several new features. First of all, the National Code of Conduct is the whole purpose of the National Code is to promote positive behavior and to protect the safety and security of schools, including the students, the teachers, the parents, all members of school communities. So the National Code addresses safety and security. Also, we've added to the Education Act a new section on search and seizure. And what that means is it gives the principals and the teachers the authority, if they suspect that, for example, a student has a weapon or drugs or is threatening to harm themselves or others, that the principal or teacher can search their persons. If they find a weapon, they can seize it and call the police. So we've added those provisions to the Education Act, which is new. So safety and security have been addressed in several different ways, and it is a concern that many people have identified that they want to see clearly addressed, and we've attempted to do that.
Thank you very much, Monica.
Thank you. I have another question. I see you have in technical and I forget the other word for the education system, but I don't see anything like the skills such as we need things like sewing schools or joinery, arts and craft, and so forth.
I think we handle that under the area when we speak about alternate education, where you will have technical vocational, and we are very much aware that the Ministry of Education is also moving towards the establishment of technical vocational schools. So the Act does make provision for various different types. That's why we speak about the inclusiveness of education.
Okay, thank you very much. One more. You said about homeschooling, and you said a national curriculum will be provided. How do we acquire the curriculum?
The national curriculum which is used will be mandated. So if you're homeschooling a child, the national curriculum, when you go to register and get permission, because there is also a process if you have to homeschool, you will be assisted in getting all the relevant curriculum, the national curriculum, which you should follow if you are homeschooling your child. Normally, you would go to the chief education officer, you would get your letter, you would get your stamp of approval. There is a process. Homeschooling does not just mean that you can keep your child at home and do as you please. There is a full process that must be followed, and the Education Act definitely supports that.
Thank you so much.
Someone is, I saw Ave Maria hand is up.
Huh? Good night.
Good night.
Yes. You mentioned about loitering on the school compound, and I also heard you mention that there was nothing about loitering out of school. Now that you have mentioned it, I think it's a good idea to bring it in. My question is it too late to make that suggestion, since this is just a review of the draft right now? It's at that stage. So is it too late to bring it in?
We are looking and taking down all your suggestions. But I also need to mention here that when we are doing this revised Education Act, there are other legal documents that must be aligned, or the Education Act must be aligned to. So we will be looking at this. It has been raised at other sessions, what can be done. So we need to get a legal, because when a child leaves the school compound where they are within the safety ambits of the principal, the school, the security guard at the school, and they are on their way home, the principal no longer has jurisdiction over this child because he's not on the school compound. So this is something that we will need to have a discussion on and see how it can best be handled, or whether it can be incorporated elsewhere. Monica, would you like to add to that?
Thank you, Fortuna. The issue of student behavior outside school hours has been raised, and as Fortuna pointed out, question, because the principal and the teachers have sponsored events. But outside school hours, really parents are responsible for their children's behavior. So this is a topic of conversation that's been ongoing, and we're trying to find a path forward that honors all the existing laws and looks at this issue as closely as we can. Thank you for raising it.
Thank you very much, Monica. I saw there's another hand up. Yes, Ms. Alphonse.
Good night. My question is regarding scholarship.
You're muted, Ms. Alphonse. Unmute yourself.
Hello.
Yes, now we can hear you.
My question is regarding scholarships. Why is there only one scholarship, and why is it limited to Cape students when Sir Arthur is also offering associate programs?
I will attempt to answer that. These are not, we didn't say one scholarship. We addressed, the address was scholarships, okay? Island scholarships and bursaries. Whether it is one or it is two, this is not a decision that can be placed in the Education Act. The minister and the cabinet of ministers may be able to increase the number of scholarships, but we cannot place this in the Act, and I cannot give you an answer here tonight as to why it is only one or it is two. Yes, we know that there are associate degrees, there are also CAPE. There are also a number of other areas in education where government might decide to consider awarding bursaries and scholarships. Ms. Alphonse, does that answer your question?
Partially, yes.
Okay, partially, but I think these are also discussions that can take place outside of the Education Act. Ave Mario, I notice your hand is up.
Yes, good night.
Good night.
It is true that it is the parents' response that has left the school. However, when students leave school, you have all that violence that is taking place on their way as they go home or as they come to school. It spills over into the schools. And you have all this indiscipline taking place where students are out of control in a lot of the schools. So I believe that the Education Act should make provisions for maybe the education minister, for principal, whatever, to address parents nationwide when students are behaving in certain ways. Mention it to them, because I notice that a lot of times nothing is said about the behavior of students. The parents need to be reminded. Okay, so the Education Act should make provisions for those in authority, those in control of the schools, to actually address parents and call them out on the behavior of their child when the child has left the school. Thank you.
Well, if I may respond very quickly to this, I think the Education Act, the Code of Conduct, and the Education Act is addressing student behavior. But when it comes to calling out parents and putting this, that the minister should do this, I think we have seen over the last couple of months that the minister and personnel within the Ministry of Education have been coming out in public and been, speaking on the issues. The responses to some of the measures being proposed, have received various comments from members of the public. But as we have said, when a child leaves school and it goes back, and as we speak tonight, I am sure in Canaries, a measure is being taken in that there is a town hall meeting taking place on parenting, because many times we say that the root problems lie within the home. So one of the strategies being used is, how can we help parents to better nurture and tend and raise their children to be better citizens? Yes, we have seen this breakout of violence out of the school, in school, and this sort of thing. And within the school, the Education Act and the regulations is going to address how principals and teachers deal with any in-school violence and misbehavior. So it is there. I hear the voice, I hear the cry, but we have to know the limits to which educators or principals can be held responsible for behaviors of students outside. We must make parents more accountable and responsible for their children's behavior.
Mrs. Anthony, if I may, also one of the strengths of the new Parent-Teacher Community Association is to bring community into partnership with parents and educators around creating positive behavior in the community. And I think that the vision for this new structure to the association is to I think actually one of those who attended one of the other town halls said it actually enforces the perspective that it takes a community to raise a child. And previously, parent-teacher associations were not as directly encouraged to include members of community in that. So we are hoping that association can help to address some of those issues and make everyone assume some responsibility, including the students, for positive behavior, both on the school property and in the community. I I also, if it's okay with you, Mrs. Anthony, I'd like to go back to the
Right
question
ahead.
about. I'd like to go back to the question about the St. Lucia Island Scholarship, because the way that the legislation is proposed and drafted is that it does say St. Lucia Island Scholarship as a singular scholarship. So that observation is quite correct. However, Section 180, Clause 4 says that the cabinet shall determine the number of scholarships to be awarded each year. So it actually is intended that even though the section is called scholarship, it will be up to cabinet to determine the specific numbers. So perhaps that might address the question raised earlier.
Yes, thank you very much, Paula. I'm sure Miss Alphonse is feeling a lot better now. Thank you. I see Miss Emmanuel, your hand is up.
Hi, good evening. Thank you for the opportunity to ask a question. I was made aware that there is one truancy officer and one officer for, I forget the title, attendance, island-wide. Can there be something mandated to ensure that there are sufficient persons employed for that role to address the needs of those students who are vulnerable and they need the attention? Can it be included in the Act?
We have included in the Act, but we have not stated the numbers that the government or the Minister of Education or the ministry. But I am sure in some discourse, some communication, there may be the possibility of an increased number of attendance officers.
If I could add to that, Fortuna, please, because it's a very good question. And we've had that question the last couple of nights, for example, about the number of counselors in school, or is there anything in the Act about teacher assistants or the number of teacher assistants? And with regard to the Education Act, those are all staffing decisions that are made by the Ministry of Education. They don't go into an act. As Fortuna has pointed out, we have described the duties of a school attendance officer. It certainly is possible to have more than one, but we can't state numbers like that in an Education Act because the ministry makes those decisions and because the numbers fluctuate over time. And so the ministry needs that flexibility to be able to make staffing appointments and change the numbers as the needs of the education system changes.
Thank you very much, Monica. And for example, this will be a policy decision of the ministry, when the need arises. But placing it within an Education Act, we cannot mandate numbers. Do we have any other questions in the chat? If we don't, we can move ahead.
There is. Actually, there is a question in the chat.
Mm-hmm.
The Ministry of Education is now mainly or fully responsible for the registration and placement of students in infant schools. How does protection from discrimination through universal education work in sync with denominational schools, particularly where moral and social issues are concerned?
Yes, we are very much aware that, and it's not today, that registration of kindergarten has been managed by the Ministry of Education. When it comes to discrimination, I think we have to rely on persons' integrity, persons' professionalism, and many times, what many parents are not aware of is that before registration takes place, the ministry would have carried out a survey to find out the number of school places, the population of a school, And then, because we know very well that a lot of parents would have preference choices, but sometimes we cannot always. And the wishes, hoping that, as we said, for the Education Act, that there is a sense of justice and fairness and high level of professionalism in the working of persons responsible for education.
And I believe we have another hand raised.
Yes, Mr. Harrell is with us. Thank you, Mr. Harrell. Go right ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Anthony, and to the team. I'm grateful that you have stuck to this task since it first started some 2 years ago, when I did make a little input. I have reviewed what has been produced, and I do intend to comment more fully, but I just want to zone in on the specific point with regards to principals and staffing. The language in the Act is somewhat ambiguous as to what staffing means, staff vis-a-vis teachers. I think we could tighten that up, because when it refers to staff, it refers to people like the janitors, the secretaries, and all that sort of thing. And then teachers. I don't see the language in the Act mandating the principals to manage their staff, the teachers. I find the language is somewhat not forceful in how principals manage, appraise, discipline, call teachers to account. We have, and it's perhaps the elephant in the room, but we do have across our country teachers who bring very toxic environments to the staff room, and are very difficult at managing. And principals find it very difficult to manage those teachers, because the teachers know that there's very little that the principals can do to them. The process is somewhat ambiguous as to whether the discipline and accountability of teachers lie within the ministry or within the Teaching Service Commission. Or is it the DEO, or is it the Chief Education Officer? But this is problematic, and it certainly affects the school environment and the productivity as far as the students are concerned, and the overall efficiency of the school.
You made a comment, Mr. Harrell, that you think the language needs to be tightened, or needs to be more forceful?
Yes, both. And in particularly, I'm referencing section 1, I think is 176, where you have listed the duties of the principal.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And we go from A to double B.
Monica, you want to come in on this? Because
thank you, Fortuna. This is a really important point in terms on a couple of fronts. Thank you for raising it. First of all, as you've referenced, throughout the Education Act, there is crossover between this proposed legislation and other laws in St. Lucia. For example, when we look at discipline and prohibition against alcohol on school premises, we also cross over with the Liquor Control Act. There is a question that you've raised about the jurisdiction in terms of where does it rest with the Teaching Service Commission, and there is an act governing the operation of the Teaching Service Commission, or with the Department of Education. So this is an issue that crosses those boundaries that we're attempting to navigate. It's really important to hear the perspective that you've expressed about the need for greater clarity. And as Fortuna pointed out at the start of the presentation, one of the things we've tried to do throughout the Act is to have plain, clear language. So if you're finding that there's ambiguity there, it's important that we know about it and we can follow up on it. So thank you very much for raising that issue.
Thank you very much. Because you see, even at subsection 2, I'm referencing subsection 176, you see that it says that the principal who fails to perform a duty specified in the section is liable to disciplinary action by the Teaching Service Commission. But we don't see any sanction where the principal can control his or her staff or his or her teachers. And that's the working arm of the Act, or what happens in the school on a day-to-day basis.
Thank you. And one of the questions that has been raised as well is that we haven't explicitly addressed staff, like support staff in schools in the Act, in terms of it may be teacher assistants, it may be housekeeping personnel, bus drivers, what have you. And so you're pointing out, too, the importance of differentiating between staff and teachers explicitly in order to make that clarification. So I've just made note of that.
Yes, I think we would need to look into that. And probably most likely there will be need to revisit that section. So we thank you ever so much, Mr. Harold, for bringing that to our attention, because this is very, very critical for the functioning of the Act and the regulations, the code of conduct that has been developed to support the Act. So thank you very much. Sister Rufina, I see your hand up.
Yes, good evening, Mrs. Anthony and everybody else. My interest right now is the denominational school and the agreement in writing with the minister. Are we going to revisit that? Because I'm not sure there was anything in writing before.
Revisit the agreements between the...
If there was one, Mrs. Anthony, if there was one. So I think this is an opportunity now that we are revisiting the Education Act to put things in order.
Very good observation, sister. Very good observation, because we would need to find out if there has been a written signed agreement between the denominational schools and the Ministry of Education or Teaching Service Commission. So we have some work a bit of research to do. Thank you for bringing that to our attention.
Thank you.
Mrs. Anthony, if I could add, we had a question in the chat box. How do we define homeschooling? Which is a really good question. And we do have a definition of homeschooling now in the interpretation section of the Act. And I'll just read it out for you. Homeschooling means the education of a child of compulsory school age at a site other than a school with the approval of the Chief Education Officer. And the homeschooling is provided under the supervision of a parent, and also may be provided by a parent or teacher using an education plan approved by the Chief Education Officer. So back to what Mrs. Anthony had referenced earlier, we now have a process in the Education Act that's spelled out for applying to homeschool your child, and that there has to be an education that's approved by the Chief Education Officer, and this is the process for homeschooling.
I think this is the process. Further clarified and added that for homeschooling, the family who has chosen to homeschool their child is mandated to follow the national curriculum, because we have had instances of children beginning the process of homeschooling up to a certain level or grade and then transitioning into the public school system. So that gives clarity to what happens. I also think that part of the conversation or interview when one applies for homeschooling, the qualification of the person who is going to be the tutor or the teacher for the child, depending on the age or the grade of the child. So the process is well spelled out. Okay. If we have no more questions, can we move to the next slide, Paula? So we said for the first time, St. Lucia is creating very positive history in that there is draft regulations to accompany the act. By law, the act does not carry with it the kind of, I'll say, power needed without the support of regulation. So we have developed draft regulations, and this is what we have done. We have part one, the administration of school. It defines the school year, I think 195 days, and what is the school calendar year? When does it begin? Does it begin before 1st of September, but no later than 8th of September? And when it ends, school vacations during Easter, Christmas, all that is defined. The school timetable. What are the textbooks? What's the school admission process? What are the school registers? Why do we have school registers? And the process of assessments. What kind of assessments? Are we going to still look for the final end of year exam to promote a child? Or during the school year, are we going to use summative, formative, or whatever other forms of assessment that are necessary? And school zoning has been addressed there. The national curriculum has been described, including aligning it with the national qualification framework for primary and secondary curriculum. And so we have done all this so that there is consistency across schools. School management for public schools, assisted schools, private schools, homeschooling, school visits, school inspections. The Schedule 7 speaks and describes the matters addressed during school visits and school inspections. So you have a completed approach to how schools are managed. So the district education officers, what do? They go with the Ministry of Education, the counselors, so all that is spelled out clearly in the regulations. School councils and associations. We know about the school inspection. Somebody says touch a little on school inspection. I know a couple years ago, one district education officer was sent to the UK and came back with qualification as a school inspector. I am sure at some point in time, since this is now in the regulations, the Ministry of Education would probably need to train, because a school inspector would go into the school, look at not just structures of school, but look at the curriculum, how the curriculum is being delivered, look at the strengths of teachers. So you have a whole process, and they look at the strengths, the weaknesses, and reports or forms are filled out to feedback where there are gaps and what has to be done. So school inspections would help further strengthen and create the avenue for what I'll call early interventions. You do not wait for things to begin to fall apart before hearing that at a particular school, X, Y, and Z is not happening. School inspectors would also help in what kind of training is provided for teachers across the education system. So this is the school inspectors and the district education officers would think. Also, inspection of schools as it used to happen before, where you had the persons within the Ministry of Education in charge of school maintenance, etc., visiting schools to check on those other issues, but not the issues of teaching and learning.
Mrs. Anthony, if I may, and Dr. Williams, yes, and Dr. Williams, jump in here. But my understanding of the purpose of this new Schedule 7 actually is to provide more detail, almost in the form of a guide or a checklist, so that everyone knows what is to happen during visits and inspections, so that it creates a sort of an understanding among all about what would happen during visits and inspections, and provides clarity around what does happen. Is that correct, Dr. Williams?
Yes, thank you, Paula. That is correct. So the checklist, to build on what Fortuna has said, provides guidance for the personnel who are doing the visits or inspections to check various aspects of the schooling that's provided to the children and the operation of the school itself. For example, they would look at the school timetable, the student attendance register, the programs of instruction that are provided at the school. They'd also look at samples of student work and look at the school policies and rules, the discipline methods that are used in the school, the assessment methods, community relations, and also safety features, such as the school safety plan and emergency preparedness plan, including fire drills and fire safety protocols. So all those different aspects. The other thing I'd like to point out is that with regard to inspections in the Draft Education Act and regulations, we have strengthened the emphasis on them. We've provided definitions, and we've also recommended that homeschooling programs undergo inspections as well as schools. Mm-hmm. And so we recommended, for example, that homeschooling programs undergo inspection at least once per school year, if not more. So we really have tried to provide more clarity and to support regular inspections to ensure that students are receiving a quality education.
And there's a comment in the there's a comment in the chat. I see school curriculum for primary and secondary, but not for early childhood. You are quite right.
Right.
That was raised in an earlier town hall this week, and we have noted it. And we do intend to make some suggestions around what would be included in early childhood education, or to address it as part of the national curriculum, so that it's not silent. So we're not yet sure about what should be said there, but we do know that something should be said. So thank you very much for pointing that out.
Yes, thank you very much, Ms. McKinnon. And I could recall at our first town hall meeting, we were also told that some persons had been exposed and trained to the high scope curriculum in early childhood. So we will look into what has happened from there. Thank you. So we go on to looking at discipline. Discipline complaints, a hearing of a disciplinary complaint. Who do you appeal to? What is the process? What is the procedure? How do you respond to the different kinds of or level of severity of discipline, either for students or teachers or staff? And who do you go to? By the chief education officer. So there can be disciplinary hearing, but there will be a clear process that would have to be followed. In fact, only today, I was asked the question, does the principal of a school have the authority to dismiss a cook? And what is the process used? Who can dismiss a cook? So these are the things that we have been asked that require some form of clarity, but we have it clearly set out in the draft regulations. The Education Appeals Tribunal tells you the notice of appeal, how much time, the process of appeal, the hearing of the appeal, the decisions, and the cost is all spelled out. If a parent, if a teacher is not satisfied, there is a process to appeal. There are miscellaneous schedules, zoning schemes, application forms for permit to operate a private school, operate a private preschool, the fees, etc. You can find all of these, and the forms will be formed in the miscellaneous section. As you rightly know, as we go through and hear your voices and we edit, there might be changes based on your voice and what you have said. Next slide, please, Paula.
Before we move forward, if you don't mind, Mrs. Anthony, I'd just like to comment a little bit more on the National Code of Conduct, if that's okay with you.
Yes, go ahead.
For those of you who have not yet looked at the proposed National Code of Conduct, we would really appreciate your looking at it. The intention is to make positive behavior everyone's business in the school community. So the idea of the National Code of Conduct is to, number one, make sure that everyone receives a copy of it, and that there's opportunities for it to be discussed in schools, and to have schools as communities that include school leaders, staff, teachers, and students to talk about what acceptable positive behavior is. And as a community, consider what is acceptable, what are acceptable responses to misbehavior. So it is intended as a positive approach to behavior, but also recognizing the fact that we don't always have positive behavior. And when we don't, how can we respond to the misbehavior? And in the Code of Conduct, there have been from many suggestions made over the last year in particular. We've received many suggestions about acceptable responses to misbehavior, which include things like in-school suspension and other types of responses, restorative justice, and different forms of supportive types of responses to misbehavior. And so what we have tried to do is provide schools with as many options to address misbehavior as possible, while at the same time giving them a code that provides them with a statement about positive behavior. So we would encourage you, because this is so new, and because this is so new, we really would welcome persons' input on it. And Mrs. Anthony, I do believe there's some other questions in the chat here, so I'm just going to.
Yes, Paula, while you read,
go ahead.
encourage all the principals that are here tonight to make the time, even before the closure of school or before school reopens, that they meet with their staff, those who have already looked at forming the parent community associations, to sit and discuss that code of conduct so that they can get a good grasp of it, and then they can share with us their thoughts on that. Okay.
And I think there's a hand up, yes?
Yes, there's a hand up, and you said there are a few more questions.
I'm looking in the chat to make sure that we haven't missed any questions.
Mr. Harold, go ahead.
Thank you, Mrs. Anthony. I am somewhat, on this occasion, going to be a little devil's advocate. I noticed that the buzz phrase, equity, inclusivity, and diversity have now crept in. And at some level, it is euphemism for the acceptance of LGBTQ, I believe the expression is, values. Now, even in the code of conduct, it is also reflected, and the issue of gender has arisen. Is it that we are at the point where we are accepting that in our school systems, issues of gender, transgender, and the full gamut are now acceptable? Is it that we are accepting that a boy can identify now as a girl and turn up at the convent, and Sister Rufina must accept the student, and vice versa?
In a nutshell, I would say the National Code of Conduct does not want to discriminate, but at the same time, I have raised this same issue and question, and I was told this is not going to happen in the education system of St. Lucia. Okay, so I know that the world is moving in one direction, but where do we as a country stand? Where do we as an Ministry of Education stand? And how do we help our principals, administrators to do the best to make sure that every child is educated? It's yes, it's a very good question, but I do not know if we can give you a definite answer. I do not know. Let's hear from Monica, and let's hear from, Paula, what their thoughts are on this.
Thank you, Fortuna. And it is a difficult question, but a very important question to address. And we have heard very different opinions regarding this whole issue. I would point out on page 40 in the regulation, in the National Code of Conduct, which is contained in the regulations. So if we look at page 40, section 2, part H, where it talks about diversity, which is one of the issues that you raised. By definition, in the National Code, it talks about respecting diversity, such as differences in language, culture, ability, disability, religion, gender, political affiliation, and ethnicity, and refraining from discrimination. So when you speak about gender, when you ask the question about gender, the discussions that we've had about gender have been more about ensuring that, for example, that girls are not discriminated against, and prevented from enrolling in advanced science and math classes in secondary school on the basis of their gender. So we've had discussions around equality, that girls and boys have equal access to programs and services at school. So it's been more of that conversation around gender, just to clarify in response to your question. And in the world, there are many very complex issues emerging, but that has been the discussion around that part of the National Code of Conduct. I just wanted to clarify that since you raised the issue of gender. Paula, did you have further comment?
No, that's fine, Monica. Thank you.
And just as I said earlier, I think, we have to, it's a complex matter and we would be guided. But thank you very much, Monica, for bringing back what our discussions have been in terms of gender, diversity, etc., etc. Mr. Harold, do you have?
No, that's okay, Ms. Anthony. I will feedback differently on it, but that's okay. Thank you for the opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, Mrs. McKinnon?
Yes, there's a couple of more questions. Back to the question of numbers. There's a question about if a number cannot be given for a truancy officer, for example, could we have a ratio like one officer to 1,000 students or something like that? Of course, if people want certain things in the Education Act, it can be placed there. But the challenge with staffing is we are sitting here in 2023 looking at an Education Act that was developed in 2005. Now, we know that there were a couple of amendments, but in essence, Education Acts aren't changed frequently, but yet best practices in education can change quite rapidly, and people may want to have those changes, and you want to have the flexibility to respond to new and creative ways of managing the education system. So our approach, our recommended approach, is to not constrain by putting ratios or numbers. I mean, by putting ratios or numbers in the Act that would constrain moving forward. Having said that, it doesn't prevent policies from being developed to ensure those sorts of things exist, and those policies can be changed over time. So in terms of our recommended approach, it is to not dictate numbers, that's a management responsibility, but rather to ensure that those types of positions are there in both spirit and by definition, so that one can ensure, or the public can ensure, that, for example, in this case, attendance is addressed. And I think there's a couple of more here. I'm just going down. There was a question we did post in the chat where persons can access the draft of the proposed bill and the proposed regulations. And I think just in terms of our approach to access to school or access to education, I think one of the things that we have done in terms of inclusive language in the proposed Education Act and in the regulations as well, is to ensure that barriers are not created for persons who wish to be educated and have endeavored through the wording and the spirit of the act to make sure that people understand that the education system is open to all. And we have, and if there are ways that you believe that the act could be enhanced, obviously we're having these town hall meetings to encourage feedback. It is your Education Act, and education is a public good, and we want to be sure that the Education Act represents what St. Lucians want in terms of education. So we've endeavored as Mrs. Anthony has said, in the well over 700 responses that we've received, to capture as much as possible in the Education Act for you to consider. But the door is still open to consider more, and that is exactly why we're having these open town hall meetings, so that we can consider things that appear to not have been addressed in a way that St. Lucians would want them to be. I think that's it for the chat, I think.
Yes. So thank you. Can we go to the next slide?
Sure. I think perhaps we've done this.
We've done this, yes. So, having done and listened to the process, what we have done, and where we wish to complete and validate this act or this bill, we need to know what are your top 3 priorities that need to be addressed in the draft Education Act and the regulations. As we had the discussions, some of them have come out. We have noted them down, but we need to know, again, if there is anybody who has a burning priority that needs to be addressed. We have heard about the need for early childhood curriculum. Mr. Harrell has brought to our attention the need to probably be a little more forceful. We need to define what staff means, and teachers, and definitely the kind of languages. So we've been making notes on what you have been seeing as some of the gaps or some of the needs. So do you have any priorities that you would like seen in the Education Act? Let me just gently say that, yes, some questions were raised, but we have also explained to you that there are some things that cannot be placed in the Education Act. We have attempted to address some in regulations, and some of them will have to be addressed through policies, because the Education Act is a long document and we cannot add everything in there. Legislation, because this Education Act had to be aligned to the Constitution, the labor laws, and a number of other. Dr. William mentioned the alcohol when we spoke about children and vendors at schools and outside of schools and this sort of thing. We had to make sure that it is aligned to already existing laws of the land. But we know that the Ministry of Education, when they receive this, they might need to create some additional policies to support implementation of the Act. So, do we have any other priorities? Yes.
Sorry, in the chat, Rafina Donat said, I would say all that was presented this evening are priorities. And so that's wonderful to hear that people think that the discussion this evening brought out some of the priorities for the Act and areas where we should re-examine in terms of what is contained therein.
Thank you, Paula. And I think Sister Rufina has also asked us to find whether there's a printed agreement between the ministry, government, and denominational schools. So this is a task that we'll have to follow through with. So thank you, Sister, for that. If all, I do not know how many persons would be in agreement that all can be considered priority. I would ask, what do you hope will come out of the Draft Education Act and regulations? Enforcement is the critical issue. We have noted. Thank you. Henry, enforcement of the Act and regulations. Moving forward. Anybody else? Okay, we have agreements coming up on the screen, if not by everybody, but I think Yolanda has said she agrees. Could we move on to the next slide, please? So the next step, we are sharing with you that the questions and comments provided by the participants in each town hall meeting is being recorded. It will be analyzed to identify main topics and issues that have been raised. So we'll do, after the 9 or 10, we will look at it, we will pull out all the similar themes, all the gaps, and then move towards any amendments. These topics and issues will be addressed in the validation and finalization of the Draft Education Act and regulations. So your input will be taken into consideration at the end of our 9 or 10 town hall meetings. The final draft and accompanying report will be prepared and submitted to the Ministry of Education. These are the next steps. Closing comments. Well, I think I want to thank everyone who made the effort to turn out this evening. At what point will teachers be engaged? I would hope that the principals, the teachers who are part of the general public hearing about this, teachers have been involved. In District 1, there were a number of teachers. Teachers were also invited. Principals will now probably, if they think that teachers have not been exposed, should do one more step, take the education, Enhanced Education Act, the regulations, and spend a day with the teachers, give them lunch and, have a discourse on it so that people are not taken by surprise or say they never heard. Well, they should have been there in droves, Mrs. Henry. Yes, but we will leave it here, Mrs. Henry. Everyone was invited. There were public announcements. Everyone was invited. But we know, I will use the word culture, in inverted commas. So we know that we will have a little more work to do, in getting... Yes.
If I might, Mrs. Anthony, I just would like to be or to acknowledge the role of the teachers union throughout this process. They have been very active from the outset. And as a matter of fact, it was the teachers union who spoke to the importance of the regulations and to ensuring that that we built upon draft regulations that were developed years ago, and so the union has provided significant input, and I believe wants to continue to provide input through the process. And we are open and very appreciative of the efforts that the union has made on behalf of its members to this process. And so if there is a sense that teachers are not aware or not involved, I think we have several avenues to ensure that teachers feel that they've had an adequate time to review this current draft and comment if they so desire.
Thank you, Mrs. McKenna. Yes. So we can go on to the next slide. Somebody says they're not getting access to the code of conduct and the draft regulation. I think you would need to probably call the Ministry of Education or check the government website where they have posted them all, because there is also a number of frequently asked questions that were prepared so that people could have read them beforehand or before coming to the town hall meetings. All this was done and shared so that it could be shared with the general public. So if you're not getting through to download it, yes.
Mrs. Anthony, I put one website. I'm just going to go pull the second website for persons just in case. So yeah, oh, thank you. Ms. Emmanuel just put the equip one, which is what I had also put earlier. And if persons are having trouble with that one, please go to the Ministry of Education website, because it is there as well.
That's right. And if they're having any difficulty, I am sure in person, the ministry always welcomes members of the public, interested persons who are seeking to continue their own education and showing interest in education. This is one thing the Ministry of Education does all the time. So I want to thank you. And I hand back. I want to ask Dr. Williams if she wants to make any closing remarks, and the same will go for Mrs. McKenna. Any closing remarks from you all?
Thank you very much, Mrs. Anthony. And I want to thank everyone who's participated in the town hall meeting this evening. It was a very rich conversation, and we learned a lot, and we have additional information going forward thanks to your contributions. So a sincere thank you to everyone, and have a pleasant evening.
And I would just echo Dr. Williams' comments. I would like to thank Ms. Lawrencine for opening this evening, and in advance for her closing, and thank all of you for coming. This is important. It's important to have these rich conversations, and we find them just critical in our recommendations for ongoing enhancement of the Education Act to ensure that it's shaped in a manner that will serve all citizens of St. Lucia well. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. And I want to say a special thank you to Ms. Emmanuel for being here with us this evening, Mrs. Lawrenson, and thank you very much, Mrs. Henry, and everybody who made that special effort to be here with us. And I am sure we will get some more feedback from Mr. Libby Herald. Thank you very much. And over to you, Mrs. Lawrenson, if you need to make any closing remarks.
I say a great thank you to you, the team, our lead this evening, Mrs. Anthony, our two consultants, Mrs. Dr. Williams and Mrs. McKinnon. And I thank you, parents, for your very valid, very invaluable contributions this evening. I made notes of all the points that were made. And Mrs. Anthony, you did mention them, but I want to go over them again. There was reference to safety and security. There was a great concern about that, inclusion in the Act. Someone spoke about skills, the inclusiveness of education to incorporate skills education. Third, addition of loitering out of school, and it is a very great concern to us all educators in this meeting, as well as, of course, parents, especially since our schools are within the inner city area and we have a major issue with loitering, and it does put our students at risk within the school walls. Someone spoke about scholarships for Cape only, and of course, Mrs. Anthony explained very ably. Someone also mentioned the ambiguity. Mr. Hera mentioned the ambiguity of the language, as well as the need to make the language a lot more forceful to allow principals to carry out their duties if they are to be held accountable. And Sister Rufina mentioned the agreement that may have existed between the Ministry of Education, government, and denominational schools. Someone mentioned homeschooling, and of course, an explanation was provided. Someone also mentioned the importance of school inspections. Also, there was mention of the absence of a curriculum for the early childhood education sector. We also spoke about discipline. How do we address discipline? And of course, there was mention and discussion about the Education Appeals Tribunal. Mrs. Anthony, you spoke very ably about the National Code of Conduct. And of course, we need to do our little homework and do some research on what's in there so that we can fully understand what support that the Education Act has in that document. And I believe it was Mrs. McKinnon who mentioned the focus on positive behavior and looking at schools as communities where we have school leaders, students, etc., all involved in ensuring that persons behave in positive manners. But also, and we are all listening, I believe, to that, how do we deal with misbehavior? And of course, you mentioned, or there was mention of in-school suspensions, restorative justice. Some of us did the training. And of course, supportive, the focus on supportive types of responses to misbehavior. But we also look at sanctions. How do we deal with appropriate responses or sanctions to those behaviors? Mr. Herald spoke about equity, inclusiveness, and diversity. Well, let us say looking at gender in the Education Act as it relates to inclusiveness. We also looked at the truancy officer and how do we deal with the one truancy officer at present. And I can't remember if it was Dr. Williams who mentioned that as the Education Act, we need to ensure that the Education Act allows us some leverage as to how do we deal with the dynamics of education. So instead of specifying a ratio or number of truancy officers, we can look at policies, supporting policies to enable us to navigate those situations. And the focus really is on dealing with attendance or poor attendance among schools. We also look at the regulations supporting the Act. So I believe we have had a very lively discussion this evening, and I'm hoping, I believe, on behalf of all of my community members from District 3, who I thank immensely for being here. I hope that those concerns will be reflected very diplomatically, I believe, in the Education Act continuous review coming from this town hall meeting. And Mrs. Anthony, you explained to us the process, what is the next step, and I think we really greatly appreciate that. So thank you so much, team, the consultants, and Mrs. Anthony for this evening's proceedings. And of course, behind the scenes, we have Miss Emmanuel from EQUIP, who is, behind the scenes, as I said, doing what it is that it takes. So I wish everyone on behalf of District 3 the very best as we further fine-tune the Education Act to really reflect what the education sector really needs now, because we have all of our duties to perform, but we need 2 legs and 2 arms to stand on so that we can, expect accountability and efficiency and all of the best from our community members from District 3 and of course from District 1 to 8. Thank you so much. Very good evening to everyone, and those who are at the 2 physical locations, we wish you a safe return to your home. Thank you so much. All the very best. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Lawrenson. Excellent summary. Excellent, in every way. And we thank you for coming and being such a supportive member of the team of District 3. I say thank you to you again. And everyone, especially as Ms. Lawrenson has said, if you're at a physical space, please get home safely. God bless and all the best. Thank you.
Good evening. Thank you.
Good evening.
Good night.
Nice.
Recording stopped.